Jackie Duval, President and CEO of the Greater Washington Board of Trade. Thank you all for coming. I very much appreciate you coming out for what will be a really interesting conversation. Susan, thank you. Thank you for hosting us. Thank you for opening up your doors, for the wonderful food. And thank you. I know a lot of you joined us last week at the National Cathedral for our midwinter dinner, which was a great success. I'm still getting a lot of positive feedback on that. Mostly about the food, certainly. So thank you for that. Very much appreciated. Long history there. Margie, thank you. Really looking forward to the conversation tonight. Appreciate you coming out to share some of your thoughts and observations and to get a really good conversation going here. So with that, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Chad.
Looking forward to it. All right. Thank you.
Okay, so if I haven't met you, I'm Susan Lacz. I'm the owner of Ridgewells Caterers, and there was like one or two gentlemen, Jake, not talking about, who didn't even know what Ridgewells was, but that's okay. Don't lie, Jake. So this is our headquarters. We are sitting in our studio, which is our tasting room. That's hence why the kitchen is open, because we seat our guests at the conference table there as they look in and they can see the chefs working. So I'm so thrilled to have everybody here. And more importantly, I'm so thrilled to be here with my friend Margie Warrell. So I have to say, I met Margie at a dine around, a executive luncheon series that the Board of Trade was hosting, and George was there. And we immediately hit it off. We've connected on so many different levels. And she's brilliant, she's fun, and this is just the magic of the Board of Trade. So I can't say enough about the power of the Board of Trade and being a member and making connections. And this is unprecedented times, and now's the time that you really need to make connections with the right people. So I thank you all for coming, and Margie, I'm so excited for you to be here. I'm going to give you a little bit of a what you're all about. A trusted leader, advisor, best-selling author, and sought-after speaker. Dr. Margie Warrell helps CEOs and senior executives eliminate hidden derailers, we all have those, drive bold leadership, this is why I love her so much, and unlock transformative results. Outside of work, Margie is energized from time. You just ran the marathon too, right? Oh gosh. Outdoors and adventure traveling. Climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, are you kidding me? With her 4 teenage kids. Like, my kids don't even want to go to the mall with me, for God's sake. It was a testament to the truth that best views follow the hardest climb. So welcome, Margie Warrell. Thank you. Fabulous book that everybody's going to get a copy of, and Margie's going to sign it for us. And so the what and the why of the courage gap. What is the courage gap, and why did you feel compelled to write this book?
Well, have you ever had one of those times, and I'll ask all of you, where there's something you knew you needed to do and yet you didn't do it? Yeah. And if you dissect that, what's going on, often it's fear of an unwanted outcome keeps us from taking action. So fear creates the gap between what we're capable of doing and what we do, between insight and impact. And it takes courage to close it, to move forward amid the fears, amid the unknowns, amid the risks. And that is what the courage gap is.
Perfect. I have this top 10 list that when I often do speeches, Takes Courage is on my top 10 list. So I love reading the book. I love the content. What's the biggest myth about courage you want to bust for leaders today?
Well, that it is the absence of the fear or risk or misgivings. And I think so often we think of it as a state that people are feeling brave, that they're feeling courageous, that they're very sure of themselves. And it is not that. It is, in fact, we can't practice courage without some level of fear or misgivings. And it is the choosing to take, courage is a verb. It's choosing to take action amid all of that. And I think often we tend to think it's a state of emotion that people feel. And in fact, it's not. It's a decision. It's not an emotion.
So how do you tell these CEOs in the room, how do you have the courage? What is your advice to them?
I would say read the book.
And you'll all get the book, so that'll be fabulous. No, seriously.
Yeah. No, starting out, I think it's really clear to just get, again, your intention of what is it that I'm moving toward? What is the desired state? Because our brains are wired for safety, for security, for shoring up our sense of certainty in the short term. And so unless we have a clear commitment toward whatever the North Star is, what's the highest intention, our commitment to a positive desired state, to what we want, has to exceed our fear of what we don't want. And often, and particularly when there's a lot of uncertainty, we focus a lot about what we don't want to happen. Oh, I hope this doesn't go wrong. We start thinking about the future of the negative, unwanted consequences. And it's not to say that we shouldn't think about those and give them some thought. You have to manage the risks. But often our attention is all on what we don't want to happen versus what we do. So starting by setting that intention and getting a focus in the right place. Because, you know, who here has found themselves feeling a little anxious in recent weeks and months? Me, everybody in the room. Well, all of that anxiety comes from our thoughts about an unwanted future state. If you were to trust that everything was going to work out fine in the end, you wouldn't be feeling it, right? But it's only natural to feel it, so I don't want to say it is very normal, particularly when there's a lot of uncertainty and there's disruption to the status quo and all the things that we assumed would happen. And so it is starting with getting that clarity. Well, what is it I want to put my time, my energy, my attention onto? That it's got to be a starting point. Because if you think about being brave and taking action amid the unknowns, you have to be able to answer the question, for the sake of what am I willing to stick my neck out, to have a tough conversation, to make a change, maybe to make some cuts in my business, to take away from one part of the business and contribute to another part of the business, maybe I cannibalize this part, you know, strategically. And so as you think about, okay, where our brains tend to go to all of these things, we have to get really clear about what is at stake here if I don't do this? What is the risk that I take if I don't take this action? And we're always looking at the short term. I mean, we're wired to look at the short term. We have a real short-term bias. What we're not so good at doing is stepping into the shoes of us a year, 5 years from now and going, what is it that we put at risk if we don't do it? And so a lack of courage, a courage gap, a deficit of courage, a willingness to take action, actually creates longer-term vulnerabilities. If you look at organisations that have slowly become obsolete, there was things they could have done and they didn't do because they didn't want to take the short-term risks. That's incremental decision-making, a lack of innovation, a lack of collaboration, a lack of making tough decisions even though there was a chance things wouldn't go well, that ultimately created longer-term vulnerabilities that put them more at risk. So sort of that peripheral risk-taking is what protects the core. And that's the CEO's role, that's a leader's role, is to be discerning all the time, zooming up and going, where do I need to make some tough decisions and step in and have to take some risks, even though I'm not exactly sure how it's going to unfold.
So how do you push someone if they're not a risk taker? I happen to be a big risk taker, but there's a lot of people who don't want to put that on the line. So how do you push forward to be a risk
Well,
taker?
I'm glad you asked that because I probably should just back up by saying this. Often when we think of this term of courage, we think of acts of heroism on a battlefield. We think of people who are, you know, that Richard Branson, Susan Lacz, natural entrepreneurial risk takers, have a high tolerance for the unknown, for ambiguity, yes. So here's what we know, is that courage is a trait. Some people are naturally more at ease with taking risks, with taking a brave path, but it's also a competency. It's actually a learnable skill. Now that doesn't mean that, you know, someone who is naturally extremely risk averse is ever going to be, you know, a wildly successful entrepreneur, no. However, we can cultivate our capacity to take action in the presence of the unknowns, in the presence of the uncertainty. We have that ability to cultivate that as a learnable skill. So, obviously, if you've got people on your team, every team you want to have a diversity of people. I mean, years ago I actually had the opportunity to interview Richard Branson. And
I want to talk about that later.
okay, but just quickly, okay. Can you deal with me to take?
Yes,
Are you agile? Are you agile here? Okay, and I remember saying
me on the island.
Okay, and okay, it's doable. And I was interviewing him for a group of people that were gathered on his island, and I said, you know, tell me about your failures and everything else. And he was talking about early on in his career, he got a third mortgage on his home. And I said, what did your wife think about that? And he goes, oh, I didn't tell her about the third one. And I remember thinking, oh, I couldn't have been married to you. Like, I just couldn't, I wouldn't have had that tolerance for risk. And obviously, it paid off. We don't want a team filled with people with that level of risk tolerance, right? So if you've got a team, and then you always want to have diversity of different personality types as well. But recognizing there's some people that are naturally going to be more risk averse, more considered, more reticent. and helping them if they are really uncomfortable with change, with uncertainty. Sometimes it's a nudge, it's pushing them to do things, but sometimes it's helping them recognize how is this putting them in a less secure place over time if they don't engage in certain behaviours. You know, getting really clear about, like, what is it that you want them to do?
Who's a risk taker in the room as a CEO and another? Okay, so there's a few here. So as a CEO and running a company, who is supposed to be pushing these CEOs
Yeah, well,
to take these risks?
well, so for those
We
of
all
you...
hire you to come in?
No, for those of you who don't know, I just stepped out of a role for the last nearly 4 years at Convening in the CEO succession practice, where I'm working with boards and helping, and I'm not a recruiter, I was involved in the CEO Institute and President Institute, so developing people to step into C-suite roles, or maybe they're already in them, and helping them accelerate whatever the change agendas were. And so, just given that, you know, it depends on what the strategy of an organisation is. It's not always about massive change and transformation. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's less so. But recognising that you need different types of leaders for different times too. So it depends on, there's many factors at play in terms of the context. But I think a lot of times people who are naturally change averse, and let's face it, none of us love change. Some of you may have read the book Change. You know, we all like familiarity. We like, it's nice. No one likes to have to figure everything out new again, all over again. But for those people who tend to be more risk averse, maybe they're not in the right role. If you've got a big change agenda and you're after rapid growth, you want to have someone who has a natural appetite for that. But helping develop, you can help develop that. And I think that's where looking down into the people and going, who do we need to develop? Who's got some of those natural traits that we want to lean on, and who needs to be developed?
Right. I mean, risk, how can you have managers, and how do you distinguish between a smart risk and recklessness?
Yeah. Have anyone ever heard of a pre-mortem? Okay, so we know what a post-mortem is. And we might touch on that in a bit when we talk about failure and how to deal well with failure. But a pre-mortem...
I don't have failure in my notes.
Oh, okay. About failure, because being able to fail well is indispensable to being able to be brave too. But a pre-mortem is where you go, okay, here's what we're thinking of doing. Let's just put ourselves 1, 3, 5 years, pick the time frame and go. Imagine this didn't go well. It completely tanked. What would be the possible reasons that this didn't go well? Let's kind of list the probability. Okay, there could be a pandemic and I've opened a new restaurant and that wasn't good timing. But okay, what other things? We didn't get enough stakeholders involved. We didn't, you know, navigate the policy environment properly. Whatever, you know, coming up, we didn't have the right people. We didn't invest enough in training, whatever it is. We weren't fast enough to get up embedding the new Gen AI into our processes. So doing a pre-mortem helps to map out all the ways that the things could derail, and then, okay, what do we need to do to mitigate that up front? But I think that can sometimes help to alleviate some of the fear factor, because often people just get afraid. It's like all of the things versus like, let's narrow that down and really look at what those things are and how do we mitigate against it.
Are you fearful of climbing Mount Kilimanjaro with your kids?
Honestly, that was not fearful. And has anyone here climbed Kilimanjaro? No.
Oh,
yes. Okay,
oh,
great.
Tell me.
As you would know, Kilimanjaro is not a difficult technical climb. It's hard, it's thin air, but it's not technically difficult. Anyone who can, you know, climb up a hill can climb Mount Kilimanjaro. In terms of technique, you have to be a little bit fit, but not super fit. We actually lived at ground level in Melbourne, Australia at the time. So I wasn't afraid. I probably was afraid of wasting our money, like, you know, us not all getting up there going, that cost a lot of money. That would be really frustrating. But I wasn't afraid because it wasn't actually particularly dangerous.
How long was the trek?
Oh my gosh. So there's different ways for people who are super fit and maybe had more time adjusting to altitude, but you can probably do it as little as 4 days. We took a week. And because my kids at the time were 13, 14, 17, and 18, and actually, slight funny story. So my husband was turning 50, and I was like, what would you like to do for your 50th? And he said, wouldn't it be great to do a safari? And my son Ben said, oh yeah, but it would be really cool to go climb Mount Kilimanjaro. And I was like, we're all like, Ben, we live at sea level. And he did this, we go to the beach, like, anyway, he did this PowerPoint, he had the Rocky soundtrack music, he had his research, the presentation, he said, imagine Dad's 50th, the family climbs to the rooftop of Africa, we will forever remember it. He painted the whole vision. And really, that was leadership. You know, he really inspired us with this vision of our family on top of the rooftop of Africa. And so we set off. We took 4 days to get to the base camp, which is about 17,000 feet. It's you know, there's not a lot of air, a lot of oxygen up there. And then we started out at about 2 in the morning, and within 30 minutes, my youngest son, Matt, was vomiting up the oatmeal. I'd said have 3 bowls, and he vomited it all. Said, thanks for the tip, Mum. I didn't realise that just the nausea. And then Ben was vomiting. And I was thinking, this isn't good. And then Ben's going, this is hard. I'm like, it was your bloody idea. And so we stopped on extremely slowly. After 6 hours, I threw up, head pounding, nausea. It took us 9 hours to get to the summit. And often when I do speeches, I have a photo of us, and I tell people it's the only time we smiled all day, standing on that, like, thank God we're here, and then we headed back down. So, but we did all make it, and we got back to base camp and found out that the guides we had hired apparently had bets that we wouldn't all make it. So,
That's great, that's great. And like, speaking of that, you also just ran the marathon. Was that your first marathon? Or
Yes. No, that's my first, probably my only.
Yeah, and what was your mentality to train for that, and why did you do that?
Well, you know, I touch on this in the book, and just to kind of make this applicable for all of us. Often when we're children or through our lives and going into adulthood, we create stories about ourselves, about who we are, what we're good at, what we're not good at, what we can do, what we can't do. And we don't even realize how much those stories can hem us in. And as a young girl, so I grew up on a dairy farm in rural Australia. My dad milked cows for 50 years. He didn't read, he was actually fairly illiterate, he didn't read parenting books. And he would call me Bumblefoot because he said I had 2 left feet and I was very uncoordinated. So I had this story that I can't run. And in my teens and in my 20s, I used to tell people I just can't run, like my legs weren't made for running. As though there was actually something wrong with me physiologically, which was just not true. And I was in my 30s before I realized actually I can run. And at the start of last year, I decided that this was the year I wanted to peel that label off forever, that I'm a bumblefoot and I can't run. And I had run a little bit more, you know, I'd done a few miles here and there. And so I just set myself a goal because I just felt that it was an empowering thing to do. And so I set about it, and it was many, many uncomfortable steps outside my comfort zone to do the training over the summer. It was hard. I am not, like, you know, the Olympics didn't miss out on a champion. But I did it, and my goal was to run the whole thing. It was never about a time. I didn't even have a watch on. I just wanted to just run it, and I did it.
That's amazing. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think I would ever do that.
You could if you chose to.
Yeah.
You just
I'm not choosing.
I want to know how I can get on Necker Island with Richard Branson.
Right. We'll talk about that. All right, leading with courage in the workplace. What's one small courageous act a leader can take to raise team trust, because we all have built these teams, and engagement?
Okay. So I'm going to get to that first thing. I want to say this. There's 2 dimensions to courage. And by the way, I talk a lot about cultures of courage. We all know about psychological safety. It's the highest predictor of team performance. And I've done some stuff with Amy Edmondson, who sort of coined the term out of Harvard. And as she says, cultures of courage and psychological safety, 2 sides of the same coin. So courage itself, this verb of taking action amid the unknowns, has 2 dimensions. One is the willingness to step forward amid the unknowns, amid the chance that things mightn't go well, because if you knew it was going to be perfect, it wouldn't it wouldn't take courage. But the other factor, the other dimension of courage, is the management of our fear. Because often people are more afraid than they need to be. When I asked earlier, does anyone think of a time where you should have done something and you didn't? When you look back, can you think, I probably should have just done it and not delayed? So often we're more afraid than we need to be because we're focused on all the things that could go wrong, and we scare ourselves. Well, what happens if I give the person the feedback and they get all upset and start screaming? What happens if I go and ask my boss and say I want support for a job and they tell me who am I to, you know, and we come up and we scare ourselves and we don't do the very things we can do. So when it comes to cultivating the psychological safety and building trust, and if you think about trust and psych safety are interwoven. There's two ways.
Trust and safety.
Trust and psychological safety. If I trust
Psychological
you,
safety, okay.
if I trust you that you've got my back,
Yes.
if I trust you that you generally do the right thing for me, that you will give me air cover, then I'm going to, which makes me feel safe,
Yeah.
to do something. Or that I can tell you I made a mistake. Or that I can say, Susan, I disagree with you went about that, and you're not going to marginalize me. You're not going to make it feel
So it's
bad.
building trust within your team.
Yes.
Making sure they
Because
trust
it's
you.
always, psychological safety is always within a team. It's not within a whole organization. It comes down to teams. You can have a great company where you've got safety over here in this team and that one, and not over here because of the way of the people and the dynamics in that team. So if you think about the two dimensions, one is how do you reduce the fear factor? How do you make people feel less afraid? You know, because the cognitive calculus will always err towards cautiousness. So I can't tell you how many times I've worked with a leader who'll say, I've told my people they can say anything to me, come to me and tell me anything. And then I talk to the people, I'm like, would you do it? And they're like, yeah, no. So it's not that the manager hasn't said you can say anything. There'll always be, the default will be towards being cautious. I'm not going to do it. So how do you make people less afraid? Because there's some people that are just not going to speak up and disagree with the boss, even if the boss says disagree. Like, they're just always going to err towards that. So how do you make people less afraid? One, you need to demonstrate a little vulnerability yourself. Share when you share, I got something wrong, I'm learning, I messed up. Like role modeling what it looks like to be humble, to be on a learning curve. I don't have all the answers. I tried this and it didn't work out. Saying I'm sorry, I messed up. Two, never giving people a reason to hesitate before they do what you would want them to do the brave thing, to take that interpersonal risk. And by the way, psychological safety is defined as how comfortable people are with interpersonal risk taking. So if someone says something to me and I don't like it, they're like, I disagree. And I go, well, why do you disagree? Or they share something, I'm like, oh yeah, I disagree. And they feel a little bit humiliated or a little bit marginalized. Everyone else in the group saw that. And you're gonna push that needle towards others going, I'm not gonna say it. Because we're always trying to take care of our identity within a group. So always respond well to bad news or things you don't like. When I say respond well, you know, sometimes people talk about, you know, there's no such thing as a silly question. I don't know about this. I think there are silly questions. Yeah, I think so too. But here's the distinction. If someone asks a question and you think it's silly, you never want them to feel stupid for asking it. You might think, well, that's a very silly question. But if you make them feel silly, okay, not only are they not going to ask a question next time, everyone else who's thinking maybe got a question is like, I'm not going to ask a question either. And maybe that was a really important question that didn't get asked. So how do you reduce the fear factor? How do you respond well when people say things you might like? 2, role model. 3, encourage people to do the things that they mightn't otherwise do. So it could be you're having a meeting and you say, you know what, in the next meeting there might be someone who's quieter. Hey, I'd really like you to contribute and share about this thing you're working on with the group. Yeah. You can go around and say, I'm going to ask everybody in the group, what's something we mightn't be thinking about here? What's something I might be getting wrong? If this thing was going to fail, what is it that we're not thinking about yet that could be a cause? I would like everyone to, always speaking last.
Yeah, no, I like to ask everybody in the room, and some of my team members are here, I'm just like, oh, so what do you think there, Henry?
Yeah.
He's not on my team.
I just like to pick on Henry.
Yeah. But I think so much of it comes down to emotions are contagious. And leaders need to be the thermometer, not the thermostat. You need to set the temperature, not be reading it. And right now, we might get onto that, obviously when there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety, it's even more important, like the tone that the leaders set.
It's a lot about the back and forth communication. You know, and I, as a CEO of this company, it's hard for me to, well, I care about what everybody thinks, and I was like, well, what's your opinion, and what do you think about this? I mean, at the end of the day, I might not, I just need to listen, and I think people want to be heard, and so that, I think, is important too. So what role does regret play in courageous decision-making?
Great question. We're 3 times more likely to regret the chances we don't take than those we did.
Why 3 times?
I'm just telling you, that's what the research
Ten.
says. That we're just more likely to regret the things we didn't do than those we did. And I'm not talking obviously doing ridiculous things. But so regret, being able to look back and go, you know what, I wished I had spoken up. Early in my career, I started my career in oil and gas with BP, and then I was in consulting. And I worked for one of the big consulting companies, and I had an unpleasant work environment where there was just some really toxic dynamics. But I was in my 20s, I was honestly lacking confidence, lacking courage. I just checked out more and more, my lunch breaks got longer, my days got shorter. The people around me were engaging in really bullying behaviours, and I didn't do anything about it. I just sort of shrunk back and retreated. And after a year, I decided to leave. And I just got married. My husband and I said, we're living in Melbourne, Australia, we're like, let's see if we can get the first overseas job. I really wanted to work and live internationally. And I was like, okay, I'm going to leave. But I'd only been there a year. And the director of the division asked me to come in. And until this point, I'd said nothing. And he said, Margie, I'm really sorry you're leaving. You know, we had big plans for you, blah, blah, blah. And I said, and I remember thinking, I've got nothing to lose. I'm just going to tell him. I said, well, I was told I would be working on this, this, and this. I was told I'd get this sort of support. I was told I'd get some development. I was told, also the people in the team were really mean to me. And he said, I wished I had known, because then I could have done something. I'm really sorry you didn't come to me sooner. And I was just disempowered. You know, I didn't have my own agency, and I was afraid of the awkwardness of it. And so I did nothing, and I left. And I look back at that, like I didn't practice courage at the time, but I'd like to think I didn't miss the lesson that when we don't have the awkward conversations, then we cut off the possibility of things getting better. Like when we don't make an ask, we reject ourselves before anyone else has the chance to. And so I know for me, as I look back on times when I've regretted not being braver, and nearly always it was in the interpersonal realm, of a difficult conversation, setting a boundary, doing something, that I'm going, you know what, where do I need to lean in now and actually have a difficult conversation? And so we can lean on that past experience to help us go, I don't want to be in my shoes 2 years from now going, you know what, you should have made that call on that person. You know, and it's interesting working with senior execs. Often when they think about, you know, what they wish they'd done sooner, there was someone, it was a bad hire, there was someone on their team, they weren't fit, they're like, oh, and we persist because we've invested in them, and it's like, oh, persist, and in the end it was...
That's an interesting concept, because like we're hiring Gen Zs all over, and it's just a different person coming out than when I was working. It's a different work ethic, it's a different everything. I can't even begin to, it's like, what advice do you have for us with hiring these Gen Zers, and how do we get them to have the courage or the work ethic that we all had?
Yeah. In terms of the work ethic...
That wasn't on your list, sorry.
Yeah. I'm a parent of 4 of those.
Yes.
In terms of courage, I think a lot of them had arrested development during COVID. So there's some serious arrested development, and they grew up on devices. I mean, or spent a lot of time on devices, so they haven't cultivated, because let's face it, the real work of communication is deeply human. I mean, people are the project, and the soft skills are the hardest skills. You can train people on the what, but it's those skills of dealing with people, navigating conflict, navigating tension, setting a boundary, saying no, making an ask. And so I do think they haven't had some of the practice that we had. Like we had to pick someone up and pick up the phone and ask someone on a date, you know, a date. And their mother answered the phone, or their father answered the phone. I talked to someone, so you know, like our kids, they're just texting, right? They're avoiding the awkwardness and the
or eye contact, or the art of the handwritten note, like all that's foreign to them, or the email protocol.
Yeah.
I mean, we should really start a business on how to get these people on board.
But I think honestly, and it's even, I notice even with my children, you know, I'm like, why don't you call them? Like, oh my God, that's so weird. Or just, yeah, but helping them, like you build it in increments. It's a muscle, and you've got to put in the reps. And so if you've got someone on your team, I would be like, you know, you've got to obviously mentor people And I think there's a need for deep mentorship.
Yes, yes.
Deep
That's it right
mentorship,
there.
more than what you would have got, right? Or whatever.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. Okay, what do I have? I've got one more set of questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. What does courage leadership look like in a polarized world right now?
That's a great question. So I just realizing that everyone has their own version of reality, and we as humans naturally gravitate to those who we have a common affinity with in terms of their perspectives. And I unpack this a little in the book, how we all like to think that we're right. My view of the world's right, and God bless you, but you're a little misguided. Or maybe you're totally crazy. But we all like to think that we are right. And we have that bias to our own certainty. I mean, certainty is actually an emotion. So people can get very, very convicted in the rightness of their stance, as we all can. I'm really right, and they're all crazy. And so just recognizing we can all be vulnerable to that bias. And as leaders, we have to be very careful because obviously people can feel very strong emotions around those things. So I think firstly, knowing that it's important for us to be challenging our own certainties. We don't know what we're wrong about. And when we come across that we're right and you're wrong, it only just drives people further away. Like as soon as you tell me I'm wrong, like straight away I'm defensive. So I think we have to be really careful about going into things from a place of the certainty of our own rightness. Because I think that's what's driven the polarization. Obviously we need to practice what it is to have critical thinking skills, listen to people with an ear for how we could learn something or have a broader perspective that we might have had before. We mightn't agree with them, but how could we just try and learn things and just think a little more broadly, even if we fundamentally disagree with their opinion. But in terms of leading, like in terms of a team, is that what you're talking about too?
Yeah.
Leading a team,
For
I mean,
sure.
obviously
We
an
all need
organization.
teams in here, yeah.
You know, I think being very careful to assume that people obviously think the way you think. Clearly a lot of people were blindsided last November. They're like, what the hell? Everyone I know about voted this way. How did that happen? Well, clearly there's a lot of people that don't think the same way. And so, you know, I think we have to role model what it looks like to be humble about what we know and to be very curious. Lead with that curiosity of trying to understand at times. And being careful not to get too convicted in the certainty of our rightness. I think Daniel Cunahan, the Nobel laureate, behavioral economist, said, you know, nothing, he said the thing that fascinated him the most at the end of his long career as a psychologist was the excessive confidence people had in their beliefs, regardless of the credibility of the sources that they're based on. You know, like as my daughter tells me, when I saw it on TikTok, I'm like, just because you saw it on TikTok, you know. But we can all be vulnerable to those biases.
Right,
Yeah.
right. What would you tell your younger self about courage? My last question, and then I'll open it up to the audience.
So I grew up on a dairy farm where my horizons extended a little beyond the backpack, and I left home at 18 and went to university. I was the first person to do that in a city. There were no dorms, just living with strangers in random places to get through college for a few years. And so I had no idea I've gone out and pursued broadening my horizons, but if I could just go back and speak to that younger self, it would be just to dare way more boldly than you even dare to do so. And to trust that you are capable of way more than you think you are. To be more ambitious than you think you have the right to be. And I think part of it's a gender issue, part of it Australian culturally, there's a cultural element, and you probably aren't familiar with the tall poppy syndrome, where you don't aspire to rise much above your rank in Australia unless you get cut down like a tall poppy.
Like a who?
Like a tall poppy, it's a flower, it's called tall poppy syndrome. Has anyone heard of it? Yeah, tall poppy syndrome, okay. So I was very vulnerable to that. Don't be too ambitious. And be very humble. And I would just have said, you've got this. Just be really bold.
Yeah. Is there anybody in the family working on the dairy farm now, or?
My brother still lives on the farm. It's no longer dairy, but he still lives there.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Margie, this has been fabulous.
Yes, Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for the hospitality
Yes, of course, of
and the
course.
discussion. It's a great topic. And a quote, I don't know if you've heard this quote. I'm going to share the quote, then I'll ask my question. And there was no attribution. It's one of these I saw on social, but I had to print it out and put it on my vision board. Your life unfolds in proportion to your courage. And that's guided me for about 3.5 years, and I'm really testing it now. But as a mother to 3 teenagers, like how, and I've got girls and boys, I'm curious, and you addressed a little bit of gender gap. My intuition is, and being born and raised in the US, and a predominant thought that men often, I'm sorry to put a label on the men here, but they often have a lot more courage that might not be well-founded. And then women who have a lot of the education and experience don't have the courage, especially when applying for jobs, things like that. And so as I'm trying to not let that happen with my daughters, but also have my son have courage, it is so fascinating. So I'm curious how you do it at home, and then anything from the research that kind of informs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I think there's a difference. I think women sometimes have to practice courage in different ways than men do. If you think about what makes us feel vulnerable, like the vulnerability triggers for men are around being seen as weak, or not being a provider, or not being strong. For women, it's not being beautiful or attractive, or so there's different things that can trigger vulnerability, and let's face it, vulnerability is the key measure of courage. But I think women tend to doubt themselves more. There's so much research that shows women don't internalize their strengths as much. Much harder, judge themselves more harshly, judge other women more harshly too. I mean, there's a lot of, you've heard of the Heidi Howard experiment. Women can be tougher on themselves and tougher on other women. Men are more comfortable with winging it. That's not a criticism. In fact, I often say to women, you've got this, just give yourself permission to wing it. And we know from the famous HP study, men apply for jobs with 6 out of 10 of the boxes ticked, women wanted to have 10 out of 10 and maybe a big fat tick and another 11th one. And because there is that difference, and even, in terms of how well did you go on a test, guys are more likely to go, I would have nailed it, even when they didn't nail it. And women, when they were told they nailed it, still goes, oh, I don't think I did very well. So there is that difference, and part of that, I think, is our conditioning. Our brains are different too. I mean, we know that women, we have different brains. And so, given that, women often have to practice courage because for them to put their hand up and put themselves forward for a role actually requires more courage of them from a guy who's like not worried at all. I remember years ago, Debbie Kasai was head of EY in the region, and I talked to her, and she said, starting out, she said, when she was a partner, she'd say to the young guys and girls in LA, come and talk to me. So the guys would be there the next day going, how can I be partner by the time I'm 30? I want to be on the highest, profile project I can get on. And the women didn't even come to her because they were like, oh, I don't want to seem like take up your time, and I'm happy to start whatever project you want to be on, And I think women are naturally very communal, and we're affiliative, and so I think sometimes we have to be careful that we're not too agreeable for our own good, not too much of, we don't want to create discord. And so when I think of courage bringing us back, fear constricts our ability to act. When we're stressed, we don't think it's smart, and we have a narrower range of actions we take, and courage expands it. When we're willing to feel anything, it empowers us for everything. And so for women, it's like, be willing to risk the rejection. Step in and put your hand up for the role, even though you don't know exactly what you're doing. Of course you don't, you've never done it. Give yourself permission to learn as you go, because women are often saddled with perfectionist standards that are less something that the guys struggle with. So to me, it's not a criticism of men. It's sometimes like, how can we sometimes practice that and get more comfortable doing the things that the guys find easier.
We need some of the badass women in this room, Linda, Irma, Susan, to Catherine, Diana, to go and help mentor these girls to get more forceful and
I also
be more courageous.
I also think that I don't think young men have it easy either. I think there's a lot of challenges.
Yeah, Henry.
I think that, you have a question.
Thank you for this. This is really wonderful discussions. The older I get, the more friends I have who reveal they have imposter syndrome. But yet these are the most confident, courageous people I know. How do you make sense of imposter syndrome and confidence and courageousness?
Yes, great question. So imposter syndrome, imposter phenomena, is this kind of lingering fear that at some point they're going to realize we don't know as much as we think and we're less worthy of where we are than people assume. And I have it regularly. I think I probably got better at managing it. And so the interesting thing is, low achievers generally don't struggle with imposter syndrome. So if you've got imposter syndrome, take that as a little compliment. You're a high achiever. If you're a high achiever, you've got the bar set here. And the more you have, more knowledge you have in a domain of mastery. I had a client once, she was an attorney in a specific area. She had it because she knew how much there was to know in that area, and she knew she didn't know it all. And so the more we know about a particular area, because we're working our butts off to get really good at it, the more we know what absolute excellence and mastery looks like, and we know we don't have that. But the people around us look at us and go, whoa, you're amazing. And we're like, oh my gosh, there's so much I don't know. Remember, Margaret Chan used to head up WHO. She said, oh, honestly, she had like 4 doctorates, but she's like, people think I know more than I do. I mean, she knew a lot, but there was a lot she knew she didn't know. But when I think of courage, so the fear is that we're going to be found out as unworthy and not as good as people think. And I think at a primal level, many of us go through life with a deep-seated fear that we are inadequate on some measure. That if you really knew me, you would know I'm not as good as people think I am, as the marketing hype, as the bio or whatever. And so, and because of that deep-seated fear, it's like, at what point are people going to realize I don't know as much, I'm not as good, I'm not as talented, I'm not as smart, I'm not as clever, whatever. And so I believe that the real imposter is the little voice on our shoulder saying, you're not that good, people are going to find out. And so, remember, coming back to courage, it is the regulation of our fear, and it's also the willingness to take action in the presence of it. And so to me, the way we defeat imposter syndrome is we don't, for women, there's a gender element here with imposter syndrome. With women and imposter syndrome, they work 3 times as hard to try and prove that they really are worthy. With men, actually, sometimes it's not taking some risks because they don't want to get found out that they're not good, so they stick with what they know they've done 1,000 times. But either way, it is not letting the fear drive. And this kind of brings us back a little bit to this moment right now when a lot of people are having a lot of anxiety. Obviously, there's massive disruption. On a scale that is pretty different, like it's not like the usual disruption, it is different. But we often think that these times are going to last forever, and they don't, they pass. And so I think of something Viktor Frankl observed when he was in the concentration camps during the Holocaust. And there was so much outside his control. Like there's the depravity, the brutality, people, obviously it was dire. And he said, you know, sometimes it's not about what we expect from life, but what does life expect from us? And so when you find yourself feeling like, I don't know if I've got what it takes, it's like, what does life expect from me now? And what would courage look like? So, yeah, I would just say that.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yes?
Thank you again for this. I think I might have signed you up for as a speaker in another event coming up. So, but you know, maybe just if you can elaborate, or maybe a few stories that shaped you as an individual, maybe inspired you to sort of go down this path of writing this book, and to the extent you're willing to share any, you know.
You're asking me or? Oh, sorry.
Talking about stories about Susan.
Oh, I got a lot of stories. Yeah. Well, it's always our life experiences, right? It's but I share one in the book of actually learning to ride a horse as a kid, and early on, looking back, I realized that I had to be pretty resilient and gritty on a farm environment. So I think I developed a tolerance for getting backed off and getting back on. So a certain level of risk tolerance that I kind of had to develop almost by the environment I was in. But in my 20s, I actually ended up living in Papua New Guinea for 3 years. And my husband and I, we just got married, and we're like, let's get a job. We were thinking like London, New York, Shanghai. He came home, he goes, I can get Papua New Guinea. No top 500 list, but let's do it. And it was very formative because it was the most dangerous country outside a war zone at the time. And I ended up being in an armed robbery. I wasn't the robber, by the way. And I had a gun to my head, and it was pretty brutal, traumatic experience. And then a few days later, I was pregnant with my first child. I found out the baby had died. And I was 20 weeks pregnant. And those two things happened a few days apart. And it was pretty traumatic. My whole world was like pretty turned on its head.
But I remember in the aftermath of that, everyone felt very sorry for me, I had a lot of sympathy, etc. And I had already, over the previous 2 years in P&G, found myself as a counselor to a lot of people, including like some of the smartest attorneys and lawyers and doctors in the country. I just found myself as a person people would confide in what they were struggling with. And I just decided I'm going to go back to study psychology. I want to help all these smart people who are hurting themselves, like are really active, just self-sabotaging. And so that was a real catalyst. One, I don't want to be defined by this experience, and I want to define myself. But how can I find something good in the shittiness of it all? Pardon the French. And then I went back to study psychology, and then ended up moving back to Australia and then to the US just after 9/11, and ended up having 4 beautiful, healthy children. So, but it was a pretty formative event that made me go, you know what? I want to make sure I live a life that is really moving me toward what is really rewarding to me, what calls to me. But having gone through some pretty those traumatic events and also some traumas in my family and tough things that. And maybe just being raised, I was raised, my parents were very Catholic, with an ethos of use your gifts for good. And so all of those things, a confluence of them all, have sort of really just shaped the work that I do. And I've always just moved toward where I feel like I can make an impact with what I'm good at doing. Yeah. That's
Thank
Great
you.
answer. Okay, so before we open it up, we've got books for everybody that Margie would be happy to sign.
$100 each.
I brought out of the vault the cherry blossom pettifours, so please make sure you have one. I want to thank my team at Ridgewells for putting this beautiful. Together, Trinard, Casey, Macy, and the guys here, and I want to thank the partnership with the Board of Trade for bringing everybody together. Again, I can't say enough about the Board of Trade and the partnership that Ridgewells has had for them for over 50 years, and how impactful it is as a business organization. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for everybody coming here. Please come up, have a pettifour. The bar and the buffet are still open. Enjoy yourselves. Margie, thank you so much for everything.